So welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Carl Jung on Becoming Yourself series. Today we are going to be talking about the interaction between the individual and society. We're going to be talking about the spiritual and psychological problems of modern individuals living in modern society and what Carl Jung had to say about that. We have got, Skip and George here as panelists. So the format is they're going to make a statement about Carl Jung's thoughts about it and their own thoughts. And then they will ask a question to each other. And then we'll open it up for Q&A, after which we break up into small groups so we can discuss the ideas further. So with that, I'm going to hand it over first to Skip and then to George. Skip, so the question on the table is, according to Carl Jung, what psychological and spiritual challenges does an individual face in modern society? Over to you. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so, that's, the challenge is that we have such a complex society these days that people have a hard time getting their bearings in the world. I mean, when we're born, we're wild animals and we start modeling our parents, and gradually we learn how to be a human being and learn how to reproduce and all that, maybe learn how to earn a living. But once the kids are out of the nest, then what? And what are you here for? And that's where a lot of people get lost in the midlife crisis. And Dr. Jung wasn't much interested in people that were learning how to become human beings, although he did write a little bit about child psychology, but mainly he was focusing on the second half of life. And because he was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor and the nephew of 7 Swiss Reformed pastors, he had been steeped in religion all of his life, but he had an insight that there was a problem with the structuring of the church. And so he sort of summed it all up in a quote. If I can I share my screen? Can you set it up, Shrikant, so I can share my screen? Okay. Oh, goodness. Okay, that is not going to work because I'm on my new computer and it's playing a game with me. So let me just read these quotes to you. So at one point last fall, I did a hour-and-a-half talk on finding the living God. And in that talk, I had one slide, which is a Jung quote from volume 11 of the collected works. It's Religion, East and West, or West and East, I guess is the way he put it. And this is the quote. For thousands of years, the mind of man has worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are naturally evolved psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. And so I've told a few theologians that they're actually in the psychotherapy business. They said, "Oh, really?" And so Dr. Jung was trying to help us understand where these things come from. And so there was a interview with Dr. Edward Edinger, who spent his entire career. He was the leading Jungian analyst of the late 20th century. He died in 1998, unfortunately. But he gave a few profound lectures and interviews, and where I have found them, I have transcribed them. And so he was interviewed by Lawrence Yaffe in about 1994. And Yaffe was the son of Agnella Yaffe, who was the keeper of Jung's biography, let's put it like that, his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And he was a Jungian analyst in his own right. And so he was interviewing Edinger. And so he asked the question, what does Jungian psychology have to do with religion? And Edinger was thoughtful for a moment. And then this is what he said, and I'll simply read what he said. Everything. You see, Jung has demonstrated that the religious function resides in the psyche and is an integral part of the human psychology. That just means that the ego, in order to be healthy, needs to have a living connection to the transpersonal center. There are two etymologies of the word religion. One etymology emphasizes that it means linking back. The idea then would be that the religious function links the ego back to its origin, to its background, to the larger entity that it came from. The other etymology of religion that Jung really preferred actually was that the word religion means the opposite of the root of the word neglect. So that religio means the careful consideration of the background of one's life, the opposite of neglecting the background of one's life. Jung actually preferred that association, although he actually acknowledged the other one, which I think goes back to Augustine. The point is that the human psyche has a religious function in both senses, a need to link back and a need to give careful consideration to the source of its being. The religious process, then, is one in which the ego has a living organic connection to a larger whole. That, of course, is the function of the traditional religions have always served. They've done it by the collective structure and the dogmatic formulations and the whole concept of God and man's relation to God that they provide the believer. They've given the individual a religious container in which he has the sense of being connected to the larger whole. Now, modern man, particularly the creative minority in modern man, has lost that connection provided by the traditional religions because they are too concrete. They haven't kept pace with modern man's mental development, so they are not in tune with modern categories of understanding. The great service that Jung has performed, and by his discovery of the collective unconscious and the archetypes and the self, he's penetrated to the psychological source and basis that underlies all of the world's religions. He's verified and redeemed for modern consciousness the validity and reality of religious operations as they express themselves in all religions. That's been achieved. I don't think we can appreciate the magnitude of that achievement, because what it means is that the psychological basis has been laid for a unified world. We've got the basis now for unification of all of the factional divisions among the world's religions. Once that is achieved, I think political unification is bound to follow. It's been accomplished. One man has done it. I wish I could communicate the fact that I see so clearly concerning Jung's discovery of the basis of all the world's religions. He's achieved by this discovery the psychological basis for the unification of the world. Now, Edinger also wrote a number of books on Jung's religious material, and one of them is called The Bible and the Psyche, which is primarily about the Old Testament, and it indicates that up until the book of Job, the book of Job is the pivot point of the Old Testament. And up until the book of Job, God was dealing with the Jewish nation as a collective. But at the time of Job, then there's a pivot, and God starts to deal with individuals. And that's what he does with Job. And then there's the Christian archetype. Now, a Jungian commentary on the life of Christ. So happens that I've read both of these books into my YouTube channel. So you don't have to read them if you don't want to. You can just listen to me read them. But I would say that there's sort of a summation here that Dr. Jung, another book by Edinger now, The New God Image, it's called, a study of Jung's key letters concerning the evolution of the Western God image. And what this is 14 letters that were written to theologians of various faiths over a long period of time. And the Jungian analyst community, in my opinion, basically deep-sixed all this. They hid it. They hid what Jung was really all about. And instead, they focused on building a profession of Jungian analysis, but they didn't talk much about the theology in Jung's work. And Jung himself didn't talk much about it because he maybe didn't want to cause his father to roll over in his grave. And also he knew that he would invite criticism from, which he inevitably did anyway. But one of these letters, but the point is that 7 of these 14 letters appear in volume 18 of the collected works. So you have to be pretty committed to Jungian psychology to even come anywhere close to understanding this. And so fortunately, Dr. Edinger pulled them out for us. And by the way, I did read all those letters into the YouTube channel as well, but some of them are quite long. The one that he wrote in September of 1957, 4 years before he died, to the Reverend David Cox, is about 10 pages long, but I just want to read one paragraph from it. He said, although all this sounds as if it were a sort of theological speculation, it is in reality modern man's perplexity expressed in symbolic terms. It is the problem I so often had to deal with in treating the neuroses of intelligent patients. It can be expressed in a more scientific, psychological language. For instance, instead of using the term God, you say unconscious. Instead of Christ, self. Instead of incarnation, integration of the unconscious. Instead of salvation or redemption, individuation. And instead of crucifixion or sacrifice on the cross, realization of the 4 functions or of wholeness. I think it is no disadvantage to religious tradition if we can see how far it coincides with psychological experience. On the contrary, it seems to me a most welcome aid in understanding religious traditions. So I'm available for questions and comments, but I wanted to give you that précis on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip. George, you're next. So what do you see as, what do you think Carl Jung saw as the spiritual and psychological problems for modern individual living in a modern society?
Well, the question says, what psychological and spiritual challenges
Yes.
does an individual face in modern society?
Please, go ahead.
And it's interesting that you chose modern society, not post-modern society, because I think post-modernity is having a different response. But I think the question speaks, for me, it speaks to, oh, by the way, thank you, Shrinkat, for having me. Hello, Skip, and to everyone else. It's good to see familiar faces. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. But I think the question speaks to the invaluable utility of the process of individuation. And what I mean by that, to augment what Skip said, is the correspondence between ego, you, subjectivity, with self, with the objective psyche. So how do you do that? And for me, one of the challenges, or the challenge, is to withdraw the projections, because that's the opposite of individuation. Individuation implies that you're withdrawing your projections. It seems to me that in modern society, we have become proficient in projecting not just personal unconscious material, but impersonal conscious material. And that's part of the critique that Jung does, particularly, and I'm sure Skip is familiar with, in volume 9, part 2, Eon. That's one of his critiques. I'm going to preface my comments with 2 quotes. The first one is by Edward Edinger, which Skip mentioned earlier, and I believe I've introduced this quote previously. If not, I'll do it now. And I think they're apropos. There are 2 quotes. The first one is from Edinger. Jung's psychology offers not only a method for psychological healing of individuals, but also a new worldview for Western man, which holds out the possibility for healing the split in contemporary collective psyche. And I agree with that. And we could talk more about what is that split if someone wants to ask me. But the individual process needs to occur not only with separate egos, but with the collective as well. And for me, that's fascinating stuff. The second quote comes from the Gospel of St. Thomas, a non-canonical text. And I believe I may have shared this as well, but I think it's also apropos with regards to the question. And I hope I don't misquote it. I didn't write it down, but I tend to know it by heart. That which is within you, if you express that which is within you, that which is within you will save you. If you don't express that which is within you, that which is within you will destroy you. For me, that's fabulous. Sounds like an Upanishad. So I think they're both alluding, again, to the utility, to the imperative of the process of individuation. And that is the challenge, I think, for modern society, to take ownership of its projections. Collectively, we have projected onto the image of Yahweh. Nowadays, we're projecting onto isms. I would claim that most denizens of modern society are adherents to materialism. I will point to people's addiction to Amazon as an example. My addiction to the Mets. We project this imperative, this inner journey onto an external object. And the challenge is not to deny the sociological richness, but to own the projections. The salvation is not being a meth fan. The salvation is not being an effective consumer. The salvation is not being an effective capitalist. The salvation is not projecting onto scapegoats. The salvation is to have a inner correspondence with the self, because the projections are projections of the self, of the objective psyche, and not, again, these are impersonal projections with regards to modern society, and that's all I have to say.
Okay, let me ask a couple of follow-up questions just to kind of delineate the issue. So what did Carl Jung think happened in the modern society? How is modern society different from the society before it?
Is that for both of us?
Yeah, both of you. First George and then Skip.
I don't want to indict anybody. I guess I've indicted society already. So, I guess I've alluded to it already. We are separate. We are living. We are addicted to our persona. We're addicted to self-image. We don't have. Some of us do. Some of us do. But I think most of us have severed, we have divorced ourselves from what Skip was saying, the religious experience, from the spiritual experience. So we look for affiliations to nourish that impulse indirectly. So modern society has created so many tribes. What does Peterson call them? Identity politics? I forgot his term, his phrase. Tribalism.
Yep.
So we project our relationship, instead of having a direct correspondence, as I mentioned earlier, we project it onto the group, that the group will satisfy, will satiate that psychic hunger. So we don't have direct correspondence with the objective psyche. Because of our addictions to the external.
Got it. Skip, what do you think happened in the modern society? How is the modern society different from the society that was before it that caused the problem that Carl Jung is talking about?
Okay, well, we have to remember that religions evolved from early Iron Age men, primarily, and some women, but they evolved from people that didn't know very much compared to modern men. And so that was all well and good up until the early 16th century. But by then, their dogma, they explained events, they were able to explain things in certain ways that became dogma and so on. But around the 16th century, the early 16th century, what happened was the scientific method, the so-called Enlightenment, which I say is actually an endarkenment, caused us to realize that a lot of these things that were stated to be true, while they may be true in the unconscious, in the self, they aren't necessarily true in the physical world. They are truths in the psyche, not the physis, as Dr. Jung explained. And so, starting with Galileo is a good example. He got run up before the Inquisition, and his penalty after he swore in a Bible that the sun orbits the earth, he wasn't burned at the stake because he swore that, but he knew that the Catholic Church kept good records, and so he made monkeys of them for all time because we have his abjuration. And so his penalty was that he wasn't allowed to look through his telescope for the remaining 4 years of his life. But in that time, he invented, among other things, quantum physics. and so since that time, science has sliced and diced religious myth saying, well, that's not true, and that's not true, and that's not true. But they were always talking about what's not true in the physical world. And they weren't, and so by the end of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche says, God is dead and we have killed him. Why? Because all the religious myths had holes punched in them. But Jung came along in the next generation and said, no, wait a minute. Religion isn't about the physical world. Religion is about the psyche. And actually, he didn't get around to saying that until Answer to Job. This book, Answer to Job, one of his most important books, when he said, every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physical world. And so it makes no difference whatsoever that a religious truth isn't true in the physical world, because it is true in the psyche. And so what Jung has given us the opportunity to do is now go back and see, how does this work? Okay, so I have a simple example. What about the football player who makes a touchdown and he points up to the sky? Okay, he's pointing in the wrong direction, because he should have been either pointing at his heart or pointing at the fans in the stadium, because in his heart he has his own unconscious, which if he was praying to God to make him strong as a football player, that God was making him go to the gym regularly. And that was an internal effort that he had to go to.
Got it. So suppose, sure, please.
Let me just finish this point, and then I'll answer your question. So that God, that internal God, made him go to the gym. The collective unconscious, which is the fans in the stadium, gave him the psychic energy in the moment to push through and make the touchdown. But if he hadn't been praying to the inner God first, he wouldn't have made that touchdown. So he's not wrong. It is God that's making it happen, but it's God different from what everybody has been talking about for the last 2,000 years, 3,500 years or more.
So if I were to, sorry, George, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to supplement or perhaps rephrase what I said earlier, because Skip just reminded me when he talks about the Enlightenment, and maybe it's a bit more poetic. I was using the analytical psychology lexicon to address the question, but to be much more poetic, I think one of the challenges of modern man is that modern man has suppressed and repressed the mystical since rationalism. And again, I don't want to dismiss the advantages and the practicality, and the outcomes of all the branches of rationalism. We won't be where we are, but we are where we are because of rationalism. It has divorced itself from the mystical.
And we can't turn our back on the religions either, though. That was Jung's point.
And one of the biggest arguments now, for as an example, is the historical Jesus. It doesn't matter if Jesus existed or not. If you're looking at Jesus as an example, or even the Buddha or any other tradition, historically, and you relate to that material denotatively, you're going to approach life in a definitive manner. But if you engage with the material connotatively, you're going to engage with the material much more richly, and the value in terms of proving the historical Jesus is insignificant. It's like Shakespeare. Who cares if he existed or not? The works are there. Engage, have a relationship with the material. So I think that's the problem of modern man, that he, she, us, it, humanity has repressed, has divorced itself from the mystical, and has become addicted, what Jung calls one directional, has become addicted to the empirical, to the rational.
Okay, I think that was a very good summary. So the way I understand it, what you're saying is that the modern society ended up focusing on the external and ignored what is happening inside. And by developed all kinds of things like persona, etc., which are all focused on the external, and all the parts which were focused on the internal, like religion, were ignored. And as a result of that, man was kind of dissociated from self, and that is the root of the problem, as best as I can, put it together from them. Now,
at a collective level, there has to be a sacred marriage from material and then the non-material in order for us to move on. I mean, to be one-directional consciously and to be one-directional unconsciously, they're both problematic. There needs to be a synthesis. There needs to be a sacred marriage, individually and socially, but it starts with the individual.
I'll just make a side point. I'm from India. I was originally from India, and I've been in the US in the West for half my life in India, half my life here. India has focused on consciousness, and West is focused on the external world. I am deeply grateful to the West for focusing on the external world, because that's why we are able to sit and talk about this. Most of us would be dead without all the advances that were there, and we would not have the ability, all the technological ability and the long life that we have, but for that. So I'm deeply grateful for that. At the same time, I think the focus on the consciousness that India has had is tremendously valuable. And in that sense, what I see Jung as bringing back the value of consciousness, or consciousness put the internal world, if you say the self, into the discussion. So now we have a chance for the panel to ask each other questions. There are a number of questions from the audience. So if you don't mind, do you mind if we can go take the questions from the audience? There are a number of questions, right? Sure. Okay. So it's going to be, folks, so we have some rules. We have 4 rules that we have used for 4 years. Rule number 1, raise your hand when you want to ask questions. You can do that by typing a question, typing exclamation mark, or raising your hand in Zoom. There are 3 ways of doing that. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Today we are talking about the spiritual and psychological challenges an individual faces in a modern society. Number 3, be brief. And let's keep the answers also relatively brief so that we can cover as many, answer as many questions as possible. Number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree. Feel free to be extremely candid, disagree with anybody on anything, but do so courteously. So those are the 4 rules. All right, so it's going to be Tom, then Wesley, then California Joe, then Faisal, then Joe, then Ayala, and then Deborah. So Tom, go ahead. So when you're called upon to ask the question, just unmute yourself, ask your question, and mute yourself back. Let's not do follow-ups because we want to get as many questions as possible. Tom, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is to Skip Conover. When you were talking, I was wondering about history, or the knowledge of history, as perhaps an alternative to Jung's perspective about religion being the connection to the transpersonal. That's it.
Well, Jung's oeuvre in the last, all of his oeuvre was only about history. And so he had a different perspective on history that is significant. I mean, he was looking at the history of spirituality throughout the world, and it gets summed up in this paragraph. This is from another of the letters, this one to the Reverend Morton T. Kelsey from 3 May 1958, and I got this out of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst. And from Thomas Arst's essay, regrettably, he was one of the first casualties to the COVID-19, I believe, but he died on Easter Sunday. So I've been doing an in memoriam for him. And so he had this quote from Jung's letter to Kelsey. It says, "We are still looking back to the Pentecostal events in a dazed way, instead of looking forward to the goal the Spirit is leading us to. Therefore, mankind is wholly unprepared for the things to come. Man is compelled by divine forces to go forward to increasing consciousness and cognition, developing further and further away from his religious background because he does not understand it anymore. His religious teachers and leaders are still hypnotized by the beginnings of a then new eon of consciousness instead of understanding them and their implications. What one once called the Holy Ghost is an impelling force, creating wider consciousness and responsibility and thus enriched cognition. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity." So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you.
Can I take a shot quickly? Yeah. Again, my first thing is, and I think we've alluded to already, at least we mentioned it. But my first question to you would be, and you don't have to answer, but what kind of history are you talking about? Particularly, let's say Christianity. If you're talking about the Orthodox version of Christianity, then I guess Jung's view is an alternative view. However, if you're looking for the not the co-op presentation of history, but if you look at the esoteric traditions like the Gnostics that Jung was deeply interested in, then you're talking about a different history, a much more richer history. So with regard to religion being a connection to the transpersonal, it is. If you engage if your religion emphasizes the connotative approach, the symbolic approach, what's called gnosis, the relationship to the self. But if you look at the Orthodox history, okay, like the Roman Catholics will preach, then you're looking at a projection with regards to a relationship to the objective psyche. It's a projection, and then you need a priest to mediate between your ego and the objective psyche through the projection, and that's problematic. And then if that's what you mean, then certainly Jung's perspective is an alternative.
Well, that's not what I mean, actually.
Okay.
The thought that I had was based on one little quotation from Cicero in, I guess, 340 BC. Let me just read that quote. Sorry about that. It says, "Not to know what happens before one was born is to remain a child." That's pretty much from Marcus Tullius Cicero. So in a way, what I'm interpreting from that is to say that if you know your history, as in world history or history of mankind, history, political history, whatever, tracing back to however long necessary, then in a way, that is a connection to mankind. Being part of mankind is, in a way, the transpersonal. Wouldn't you say that?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think your interpretation is a valid one, but it's an incomplete one. And it's a different interpretation that I would have with regards to Cicero's quotation.
Okay, next question is from Wesley from Singapore. He asks, is the Bible factual or fictional? Short answer.
Both.
Okay.
It's poetry.
Okay. We've talked about this before, so we can go to the next one. Let me see. The next one is going to be California, Joel, or Joe. Go ahead. Are you there? Nope. Okay. Next one is Faisal. Faisal, go ahead.
Hi. I wanted to bring a more the aspect of modern man as I read it from Jung. in this idea that, modern man is the one who sits at the edge of humanity, who sits at the foremost of looking upon the future and gathering all the sources of, civilization in a sense, because Jung doesn't see every man as modern man. He looks at modern man as the, I have a from the book, The Portable Jung, on the spiritual problem of modern man. I can read you a couple of things he says. He said, the man we call modern, the man who is aware of the immediate present. So for him, the modern man is the man who is, aware of the present in society, who is, fully conscious. And that's, I wanted some reflection on that from the panel.
It's not, the modern man isn't connected with the self. And because, you can go to church and you can have reasons to go to church or go to the mosque, which are social or communal. But in terms of the connection to God, you either have it or you don't. And your pastor or your mullah or whoever it is has to put you in connection with that.
But Skip, he doesn't make any reference to religion. That's why, I'm diverting from that conversation, because for him, it's about the consciousness, the fact that the modern man has left the herd, which is unconscious, which is still in that, religion is part of that community, that keeps the man unconscious. But he really talks about the one who has, he says, every step forward means steering oneself loose from the maternal womb.
What paragraph is that? What paragraph? Which paragraph?
So it's in the Portable, and it's page 456 in the chapter, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man. And really, he really talks about, untying yourself from that consciousness and untying and moving forward. And I feel like, there's a quote from an artist, Robert Morris, who says, that the artist only makes his greatest art at the end of his life, because he basically, having seen so much of what existence is, gets so terrified that in some ways, he gets to basically see truth, at the late in his life, is the case if you look at I think it's not Monet. There was a French artist who did the at the end of his life did something so simplistic in a way, after having done so complex work. And I feel like that's, he represents that in a sense. He also says that, and I'll finish with that. He also says that, and I think it's quite important, he says the really modern man is often to be found among those who call themselves old-fashioned.
Well,
I have the volume, and what I like about his volumes, the paragraphs are numbered.
Yeah.
So you have an anthology. Unfortunately, it's not numbered. I think if we have each other in small groups, I like to identify, so I could put a context on your quote, and I'll be able to respond to your concern.
Sure.
Yeah, Faisal, I would say that, your observation is somewhat correct, because Jung himself was very cagey about what he was saying about religion during his lifetime. And you have to be pretty deeply into Jungian study before you realize that things are really about religion and culture. Okay, they're not about psychology. I mean, they are about consciousness and the unconscious, yes, very, very definitely. But I think you have to be pretty far into it before you see what he was talking about. So let me just describe something that's happened to me in the last 2.5 weeks that included this group 2 weeks ago. Okay. I started to read the Bhagavad-Gita, and of course it's a Hindu text. 2 weeks ago at this group, I met Les Morgan for the first time, and Les has written a book called The Study Guide to the Bhagavad-Gita. This is his book, and it's quite a scholarly work. And at the end of it, he has 11 theme guides, themes that go permeate through the Bhagavad-Gita. And for my lights, the themes that Les describes there, I mean, Les would not agree with me, or he at least wouldn't, I don't know if he would agree with me. He might be here tonight, I don't know, but he wants to stick with the Bhagavad Gita. But the reality is that when I look at his themes that are in his book, they're basically Jungian psychology, okay? And one of the insights that I had reading that is that also, and I have been reading the Bhagavad Gita every day for the last 3 weeks, and we're going to read through it. I'm doing this with an Indian woman in Bangalore, and I had this insight that the Bhagavad Gita's story also is very similar to the famed old Cherokee legend of the two wolves. And I said, wait a minute, okay, so if the kernel of the Bhagavad Gita came from the same kernel as that story from very early humans, it had to come up not 5,000 years ago, which is what the Bhagavad Gita is believed to have started with, but more like 15,000 years ago, because the Bering Sea land bridge has been gone for 11,700 years. And so that talks about human development over a very long period of time and before civilization.
Thank you. There was one question that California Joel had for one clarification question for George. George, in your answer, you started saying postmodern versus modern. How would you characterize postmodern versus modern in your thought? And what implication does it have?
Postmodernity, which is, I would say our age, is responding against modernity, rationalism. That's all.
Got it.
You have you have other movements like surrealism and so forth.
Got it. So it's going to be Joe, then Ayala, then Deborah, Alex, and Amy. Joe, go ahead.
Given the advances by Carl Jung and other psychologists, do you feel that we are morally obligated to become more self-aware in order to ensure we have a healthy ego?
I think that if I understood your question correctly, the only way to have a healthy ego is to be moral. It's to recognize that you're this and that simultaneously. Again, for me, morality is always a subjective experience, And then once you engage with that morality, which means you're a saint and a sinner simultaneously. And then when you have an interpersonal experience, you engage yourself with another, you choose which one you're going to be. If you don't have that subjective experience, that moral experience, at best you're only going to be ethical. So depending on your context, you'll choose, perhaps, particularly if your parents are watching you, to be ethical, right? But what happens? You're invisible. That what are you going to be? So I think they're inextricable. But for me, if you're going to have some sort of sequence, in order for one to have a strong ego, you need to be tempted. You need to go into your desert or climb your mountain or descend into your cave, whatever works for you, given your context. Be like Odysseus, travel for 20 years. But whatever is your existential deal, you need to make moral decisions that are highly subjective. Then you can have a relationship with others.
Okay, next question. Skip, you had something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this Jung felt that you had to develop a strong ego in order to be able to make these moral decisions for yourself. And he often referred to one verse of the Bible, which is 1 John 4:1. And that verse, I'll summarize, it says, examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not. And so it takes a strong ego to be able to decide what is of God and what is not of God.
Thank you. Next question is from Ayala. Ayala, go ahead. Let's keep the questions and answers fairly short so we can wrap this up and then have a much more involved discussion in the breakout rooms. Ayala, go ahead. Ayala, you need to unmute yourself. No?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there were two different ways that Skip was discussing religion. The first one, which I see is Jung's way, is the relationship with a larger whole. And the other one is more theology. And the examples were taken from Christianity, which is only one religion out of the Abrahamic religions. And then we have all those Eastern religions, which are very different, and African religion. So I will talk about religion the way as theology, as a community, and as a deity, which is some supernatural power, higher power that is supernatural. So why you ask the question, why Shrikant, why modern society showed, I think, a decrease in religion? So first of all, science and technology have progressed in modern society, so they give a lot of answers, which doesn't require the God of the gaps of previous times. Two, the rapid normative change that weakened the power of tradition and faith. Every time there is rapid social change, norms clash, social roles clash, tradition is challenged. And number three is that modern society has become so complex that it brought a rise to heterogeneity and individualism socially. So they took away from the community, from the close, tight, face-to-face community in previous history. Yeah, and by the way, postmodernism is
let's keep it at that. So because it's a very significant point. I think it's a very, very good observation. Excellent. Thank you. Does George or Skip want to respond?
I would say that although Jung focused on the Abrahamic religions in a lot of his writing, because what he observed was that all of them have commonality, of course. He was really talking about all religion. And as he put it, he had to leave hints. He couldn't, in his time, just say what he thought, but he left hints. And so, for example, I got hit over the head with this hint in the last 2 weeks, where I opened the Red Book to page 154, the folio edition, and there is his painting of Philemon, who was his manifestation of the self during his Red Book period. And right next to it is a quote from the Bhagavad-Gita, and I'm looking for the best translation of it here at the moment, but it's basically whenever iniquity gets out of hand, then I manifest myself. And in this case, this is Vishnu saying this in the Bhagavad-Gita, but he hand wrote that in the Red Book exactly next to Philemon, who was his image of the self. And I never grokked that the two were connected until I started reading the Gita. And so here are the two verses. I come into being from age to age with the purpose of fixing Dharma as a refuge for those who do good and as a doom for those who do evil. So Arjuna, when one who truly knows my divine birth and action leaves the body, that person does not go to birth again, but goes to me. The quote in the Red Book, which isn't handy to me at the moment, is a little bit different from that translation, but he was definitely putting that hint in there for us to find.
Thank you. George, would you like to add anything?
No, that's okay.
Okay. All right. So the next question is from Deborah. Deborah, go ahead.
Hi, you mean me, right? About when it's Islam?
We can barely hear you.
There's an audio disruption.
Okay. Okay. Let me turn up my volume. Is that better?
No, Deborah, go ahead and type your questions. I'll read it out for you. Next question is from Alex. Alex, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant. Thanks to the panelists. I have a question about Gnosticism. So the word came up once or twice already, and I know that Jung drew heavily on the writings of the ancient Gnostics. So my question is about the dualism within Gnosticism. So I know that the Gnostic view tends to be quite dualistic, between the material world, which is seen generally as evil, and then there is an inner world, the world of gnosis, which is supposed to be the world of salvation. I'm wondering, does Jung maintain the same dualism, or does he go beyond it? And if he does, in what way does he do that? If you could say a few words, because I know with Jung there is this emphasis on wholeness, and so for me it's a bit of a clash, because he draws on Gnosticism, and yet he wants a kind of wholeness. So how exactly does that work? Thanks.
That's a good question. Initially, I guess in the form of a preface, again, the idea of Gnosticism is a broad umbrella. It's a very broad umbrella. So there are different Gnostics, from northern Turkey and northern Africa, from Syria, in the Balkans, and then even with that, I printed out earlier, they're the mystical, they're the ancient mysteries as well. And then you have these the synthesis of all these traditions in the Eastern Mediterranean, by the Levant area and so forth. But the idea of dualism comes from the Zoroastrianism as it moves westward. So dualism is really a Babylonian idea that comes to Alexandria, from Babylon to Jerusalem, from Babylon to Alexandria, and then it's introduced into the lexicon of the 1st and 2nd century. I just want to clarify that. To address your question about is there a contradiction regarding Jung's affinity and embracing the Gnostics, because he was interested in the Gnostics, and he was behind what eventually became the Jung Codex back in 1945, Gillespie and those folks, when they found the Nag Hammadi digs, and so forth. But none of them, as I'm familiar with, possesses dualism. Those Gnostic texts that he grappled with, because the Gnostic texts, they're talking about dualism. I don't think they were there in that big. They come from further, again, from further east. And then the early Christians begin to pick that up idea, particularly what becomes the Orthodox Christian. The idea of dualism with regard to holism, I guess the way to come to terms with that is that in alchemy, one needs to separate before there's unity. You need to have dissolution before you have, what's the word they use? Before there's coagulate, before there's coagulation. So you need to separate, you need to have some sort of dualism, and then you need to have a marriage. Jung also addresses this, and I think Skip is familiar with this, in Eon. Particularly, I think it's chapter 5, when he talks about Christ as a symbol of the self. And he introduces the idea of Christ and the Antichrist, and this enantiodromia, that when this becomes the opposite. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
I'd like to append that a little bit. First of all, dualism is in the essence of Jungian psychology, because all psychic energy comes from the opposites. And the best place to look at that, to be centered, would be to look at Esther Harding's book called Psychic Energy, Its Sources and Transformation. Or you can also look at Eric Neumann's book, The Sources and History of Consciousness. But Esther Harding's is really bang on, and clearly states that it's about opposites. So everything has its opposite.
That's right.
And enantiodromia is about the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. As far as the Gnostics are concerned, I think the big thing that came out of that for Jung was the point that you can understand nothing psychologically unless you've experienced it. And the Gnostics were about experience of God, and the church treated that as a heresy because the church wanted to intercede between the individual and God. And the Gnostics were about the experience of God. So if you think of a basic example of Adlerian psychology, if you tell a child a stove is hot, they're not going to believe it's hot, and they're not going to know what hot is. They can only know it when they touch the stove. Then they know what hot is. And so the whole point about psychology in general is you can't know anything in psychology unless you have had the experience. And so I think those two key points are very important here.
Thank you. So let me ask a question for Deborah. She asks, do you see a correlation between Jung's theories and the concept of personal jihad in Islam? That is the internal struggle that we all have to do the right thing.
Yes.
George, any comments?
Yes, I would agree.
Okay. Okay. So next one up is Amy, then Jeff, and then Chachi. Amy, go ahead. Okay, let's go to Jeff.
Hey guys, thanks for an excellent presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I confess to not be a huge student of Jung, but I do know quite a bit about various takes on Christianity, and even having translated several books of the Bible from the original languages. And so my sense of Jung, I'm a bit of a cafeteria Jungian here, and so some of his phrases some of his quotes that mean the most to me are, life is crazy and meaningful at once, from his Archetypes of Collective Unconscious book. And man positively needs general ideas and convictions that will give a meaning to his life and enable him to find a place in the universe, from Man and His Symbols, page 112. And the fact is that certain ideas exist almost everywhere and at all times, and can even spontaneously create themselves quite independently of migration and tradition, from Psychology and Religion, West and East, 1969. And so I have always been disappointed that Jung sought to so ground and orient his thinking and analysis of human beings in religion, and specifically Christianity, because I have major questions and concerns with regard to those theologies. And instead have adopted this more, kind of, if you will, at least in the spirit of progressive revelation, things that are just beyond those worldviews that Christianity provides. And I wonder what you think about that. I see a deeply spiritual orientation as very important to find meaning in the world, but far, far beyond the frameworks and the alleged history and all the different theologies that have emerged from Christianity.
Well, I don't think that analysis is correct. Jung used Christianity as examples of things in his writing, but he was by no means pushing Christianity. And in fact, in his lifetime, the last time he darkened the door of a church was his wedding day until his funeral. He never went to church after his wedding day. And so to suggest that he was proselytizing Christianity is just not right at all. And if anything, he was seriously criticizing many major aspects of the development of Christianity, particularly in Ion, and particularly in Mysterium Conjunctionis, and particularly in Answer to Job. And so, that's, I just disagree with your position, that's all.
George, any thoughts?
I'm not sure what Jeff's position is. I'm not sure.
Well, what I heard.
Let me try to recapitulate it, and Jeff can tell me if it is correct. Well, what he's saying is that he agrees with the need for deep spirituality, but he disagrees that of letting Christianity to be the specific religion of Christianity as being the example of doing that, and talking only with respect to that. Is that fair, Jeff?
Okay.
That's very good. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
George?
Then I would agree with Skip. I mean, the only reason Jung spoke about Christianity is because he was a Christian. Simple as that.
Or he was raised as a Christian.
Yeah, he was raised by Swiss reformists.
Well, I don't want to. It's not something that I want to debate. But seriously, I could pull a whole slew of quotes from Jung about Christ, and that would make my case here. But that's okay. I get it, and I'm not a great student of Jung, and so I respect your points.
Thank you, Jeff. Next one up.
Yeah.
Let's go to, we'll take the last two questions, and then we can go to breakout rooms to discuss. Great deal. Sorry, Skip, you were saying something? If you can just repeat brief, yeah.
Yeah, very brief. That please keep in mind that Jung's ideas developed over a 60 or 70 year period. He wrote for 60 years, and they evolved. And so sometimes what he said in the 19 teens didn't match what he said in the 1950s. And without
thank you, Skip. So have mine.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Next up is, its last two questions are from Chachi and Paul. Chachi, go ahead.
Hi, thanks you guys. Excellent presentation tonight. I just had a question because I watched the video and they talked about about man's desire for power and feeling insignificant and impotent, and how that was a motivation for this spiritual connection that he would desire to make. And I was just wondering how you felt about the idea of power being a motivation as opposed to a search for spirituality, or how that would tie together.
You want to take that one, George?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it.
No, I'll take it too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot has to do with typology, with regards to with power. I think the power impulse is significant depending on one's type. Jung was a particular type, and he had an affinity for a certain impulse. So I'm not sure if I understood your question as well. My apologies. Chachi? Yeah. So maybe if you could rephrase your question.
Well, in the video, he talks about how people affiliate with different types of like radical religious groups, or they form alliances with governments and organizations as a way of satisfying a need for power. And I'm wondering how this, because you talk about it more like the spiritual being a need to kind of put your psyche together. And I'm wondering why the video talks so much about the need for power as doing that.
Religions have been weaponized for political power, for power in the temporal world for the last 3,500 years more. Okay, and so the opposite is between love and power. Okay, and that's a duality. And so there are plenty of cases throughout history where religions have been used for political weapons, and including popes, riding horseback and using swords and all sorts of stuff. And so you have to make a distinction between how the religion is being used and weaponized for some purpose, and how it is used in its true role for the human psyche. Is it religion is for the spiritual world? It's not for the temporal world. That's why we have separation of church and state in the United States.
I think, and now I understand your question. Again, when I use the term spiritual, I'm implying, and maybe I should be much more explicit when I speak, but I'm implying introversion, an inner journey. It seems to me the last 2,000 years, the religious structures have arrested that. They've become much more political, much more economical in terms of their orientation. Sure. Subsequently, it has facilitated and nourished projections. So power, if it's exercised spiritually, can be quite creative with regards to how one engages with the other. However, if power is projected, then it becomes, from my perspective, quite nefarious. Okay, particularly if it's employed for polyecho imperatives. Okay, and that usually leads to oppression and injustice. Okay, and how do you deal with those opposites is problematic. So for me, the spiritual is when you go within, and then you take that material to be creative with your engagement with social consciousness, with collective consciousness. However, if you don't do that, then you become vulnerable to being mesmerized by projections. And those projections have been engineered, sister. They've been engineered. And they've been used for political and economical purposes. And religions are just as complicit as other structures.
Thank you.
With regards to power.
Okay, last question is from Paul. Paul, go ahead. Paul, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I like the name Paul. Always
Okay.
did.
Okay. I wrote. Is this me or is this? I wrote the
Yes.
question into the chat. Can you
Go
read
ahead.
it, please?
Okay. Okay. Let me find it. Give me just a second. Yes. So the question is, what would Jung think of the modern attempt by physicists to solve the spiritual problem by linking science to ancient teachings and science as actually demonstrating the validity of Eastern vision of self relationship to the universe? Would anybody like to respond to that?
I didn't know physicists were doing that. Oh, what?
Yeah.
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 Well,
Okay. Go, Skip.
I think we're talking about maybe quantum physics here, and I think that there are a lot of people that say exactly that. And Dr. Jung worked with Wolfgang Pauli for 25 years. There's
he also
a
worked
book
with
called
Einstein.
Adam. Yeah, and there's a book called Adam and Archetype, which is about letters that were exchanged between Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and Carl Jung. And you know, when I was first looking at Jungian psychology, I said, "Wow, how's that happen?" But if you read about quantum physics, then you start to get you start to see what they were talking about. And you know, there are certainly spiritual aspects to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just quickly, as I read the question, I just I've been having a tough time localizing questions. I can't find them. But this one, as I read, it says, "What would Jung think of the modern attempt by physicists to solve the spiritual problem?" It seems to me, I don't think physicists are trying to solve the spiritual problem. However, I think many physicists are employing the spiritual lexicon to address their challenges. And for me, that's incredible. And I think Jung will be excited. So I don't think they're solving the spiritual problem. However, they're approaching the riddles of the universe with a spiritual attitude, if that makes sense.
All right.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Skip and George. It was excellent day as usual.